Hello and welcome back to Life Unscripted. Today, I have a returning guest, someone who's very, very dear to my heart. Her name is Stefanie Barthmare. She was my therapist for years when I lived in Houston, and she's been on the podcast before on #NoFilter. And I did an interview with her on my website, and I looked at it today, and the title was an interview with the woman who changed my life. So
Oh, I
how's that
love
for an
it.
introduction, Stephanie?
I
Welcome.
love it. Thank you. I'm so glad to see you, Julie. It's nice to be here.
And I'm really happy to have you. So obviously there's so many things I could talk to Stephanie about. There's so many things I'm sure a lot of you who love therapy and talking to therapists would love for me to talk about. So I've narrowed it down to a few things that are A, relevant in my life on some level, and B, topics I think that'll really resonate with a lot of my audience, knowing the target demographic, the demographics. So the first thing I want to just jump in because it's going to be a jam-packed episode. Something I'm really working on is focusing on what you can control, on what I can control, and trying to ignore in a way the rest. So can you talk a little bit about the concept of control and why it's important to try to only focus on the things that we have power over?
So that's a really important question, Julie, focusing on what you can control. And first, you'd like me to talk about what I sort of experience control as,
Right.
and then why it might be important to focus on what you can control. Well, first part of your question, I experience control as sort of a desire to mitigate or keep under wraps this feeling of either anxiety or fear or some kind of upset, distress, really. It's a distress signal that you're experiencing and you want it to go away. You want something to happen to make that painful or distressing feeling go away. And so you exercise some power. It's really kind of the second part of the control, is that you're exercising some power or influence over the situation to make it go a different way.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I experience the
That's
control part.
so, and it's funny as you were saying it. I know at least in my experience, it's really to mitigate that anxiety, because if I have control over it, then I can control that I'm not going to get anxiety over that situation. So,
I won't feel bad.
yeah,
So I won't feel
right,
bad. If I
right,
can control that feeling, then I won't feel badly. And by control, we're wanting to exert some power, exert some influence so that I don't have to have this uncomfortable, painful, or distressing
feel
experience.
right. So, what are some? And I know it depends on the person and the situation, but what are some practical steps or actionable steps someone can take to kind of trust the process and let go of that control? Of course, if it's something you can control, you can work on that. But if it's something that's totally out of your control, you really have no influence over it, what can someone do in the moment, especially in the moment?
So before I attempt to kind of, give some practical feedback on that part, I think, the second half of your first question was, why is it important? Those two things are kind of joined. What are
Hmm.
practical steps, and why
Hmm.
is it important to focus on the parts that I can actually influence?
Hmm.
So, for example, the weather, I actually can't influence, right? How long a hurricane's going to last, or whether it's going to be sunny or rainy, I can't
Hmm.
influence that. But what I can do is focus on what I do when I leave the house. Either bring a jacket if it's going to
Hmm.
be cool, bring an umbrella if it's going to be rainy, or bring some sunscreen if it's going to
Hmm.
be super sunny the whole time. Those are things that I can do to kind of meet the situation,
Hmm.
meet the circumstances as they arise.
Hmm.
So what can someone do? Well, I just kind of,
Yeah.
in a sort of practical
Mhm.
sense, talked about when you're walking out the door, you can look up or you can kind of take a look at your weather app. But more importantly, this is probably a key piece of what I'll
Mm.
say today, which is more importantly, you can kind of recognize what the climate is or what's happening inside you as those feelings start to get stirred up.
Right, right,
So the things that are beyond our control are often things that either we kind of don't see coming, or we don't know what's happening with the other person or with the situation that we're getting ready
right.
to walk into. But what we do know is about ourselves. And if we're
Hmm.
not paying attention to that part, if we're not paying attention to the fact that I'm feeling kind of tired and a
Hmm.
little overwhelmed and kind of fed up with
Hmm.
whatever circumstance, we're not really paying attention to the part that we can control, which is maybe this situation is too much for me for today.
Right. And it's a lot of times I know in the past when we've spoken, there are several times I remember where you're like, okay, now let's put the focus back on you. Because I'm
Mm.
very much talking about whether it's a relationship or whatever it might be. And I'm like, well, but this is happening and that. And you remind me, okay, now back to you. And I
Yeah.
think so often, at least for me, I just, it must be that anxiety, like that I want to be able to control the outcome, which I think is why people self sabotage, right? In relationships specifically. Would
Well,
you agree?
I'm not so sure about the why of self-sabotage, but I think something you just pointed to is, kind of in not only our work, but in most of the work that I do with people,
Mhm.
it really is like if I can tell you all the things that's going on between me and this person, or all the experiences I've had that make this difficult, then you're going to either, as the therapist or as the friend, you're going to tell me that that person's wrong and you're right. And this is the feedback that you need to be able to feel better about yourself, that
Mhm.
I'm okay. Whereas the reason I say, let's bring it back to you, is that I want to understand, not only as your therapist, but to be able to help you put into words what your experience is so that you can, in fact, make informed decisions about how to
Right.
proceed in situations that make you feel that tension, that
Right.
tightness, that anxiety, that fear,
Right.
which is really
Right.
what elicits the need for control. If I'm relaxed and I feel
Yeah.
really good about something, I'm
Mm,
having
yeah.
a glass of water by the
Mm.
pool and there's beautiful surroundings, and somebody says, hey, would you like, you know something, that I have for sale on my tray, and you're
Right.
really not interested, you can sort of with ease kind of go, oh, no,
Right.
thank you, no problem. But if
Right.
I'm all tense and I'm trying to make a really good impression, and I want everyone around to be impressed with kind of how I'm
Mhm.
showing up, and someone comes up and says, would you like something that's on my tray, you might go, oh God, what do I need to do? Like,
Right.
how is everyone going to experience this? What's the right thing to choose? And I might have a lot more tension coming up. And then I might try to pick just the right thing in order to kind of control or influence the perception or opinions of those around me.
Right. So is it a lot, would you say it has to do with surrendering to, or like, as people like, take your hands off the steering wheel and kind of letting things happen as they may, focus on the things that you have real control over, and sort of like being like water, for the
I
rest
mean,
of it,
I
and just
love that. I love that metaphor of being like water, right? It
I didn't
sounds
come up
so
with it. I'll
easy
give
and
credit
so
where credit's due.
open, right? I mean, it's a great
Yeah.
metaphor. I hear it a
Yeah.
lot. It's very difficult to do though, right?
Mhm.
Because water
Mhm.
is difficult, and I'm not going to use the word control. I'm going to use the word contain. Water is difficult to contain unless you've got a container, which kind of gives you the parameters
Right.
around which the water should fit. When you leave water out, it can kind of go everywhere. So, taking your hands off the wheel or being like water can be kind of an idealistic,
Yeah.
possibility if I'm feeling really well regulated, well rested, self-contained. It might be easier for me to take my hands off the wheel, or for me to kind
Mhm.
of, go with the flow, to kind of stay with the water metaphor.
Right.
But if I have an investment in how the other person feels or thinks about me, or what other people are saying or doing, then I'm going to be a lot more invested in kind of controlling that outcome to the best of my
Mhm.
ability.
Oh,
And that's a
yeah.
lot of work.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm talking from a recovering people pleaser. I like to think I've come a long way, but I remember sessions with you years ago where I'm
Mm,
like, but I want to be in the room because then I know what's being said.
yeah,
But really, I have no
sure.
control over what someone thinks of me, what someone might say about me, especially when I was going through my divorce and what people thought about that. I just remember so
But
many
if you're in the
conversations with you.
room,
Yeah.
you
Right.
can influence it, because
Mhm.
people will be much less likely to say
Right.
some disparaging remark
Sure.
or make some kind of commentary that's really their opinion. And that made you, or whomever, can make
Right.
someone feel a little bit safer.
Right.
Well, I mean, at least it'll minimize the damage.
Exactly.
But the truth is,
Exactly.
you're right. You don't have control over what someone else thinks, but you can kind of influence it. And that's sort of the premise behind the control, as far as from my perspective, is that
Sure.
we want so much for others to think well of us, to acknowledge us, to to have a favorable opinion of what we're
Yeah.
doing, that we kind of morph or try and, put things into a
Hmm.
certain light that may or may not be
Right.
possible.
And I think, so much with like social media and in my experience and I know other people's as well, do you is do you firmly believe or not that if someone does think negatively about you, or I don't know about negatively, but they have said
A
negative
less than
things about you,
favorable.
less than favorable, do you think oftentimes it comes from them projecting based on how they might feel in that moment, what they feel about themselves, what they might be going through? I've really had to work on that over the years. Like, just because someone might not agree with me or someone thinks this about me, it shouldn't. What is the saying? Like, don't let other people's opinions of you. It has nothing to do with you. Other people's opinions of you have nothing to do with you. Something like that.
Mhm. So if someone has a less than favorable opinion of me or makes, comments that, are not flattering or kind, you're wondering, is it more about them than it is about me?
Right.
And I'm going to say that it has a lot to do with them and may also be the kind of, you
Sure.
know, person you remind them of from
Mm,
somewhere way back when. It may
yeah.
be some kind of dynamic that is charged between the two of you. Having recently gotten a puppy, I am learning all about kind of chemistry that may
Mm,
have nothing to do with the past or history. It's just certain
yeah.
dogs kind of tend to like my rather, I'm going to say, energetic,
Yeah.
lively
Yeah.
puppy nature. And
Yes.
some dogs are like, I'm over that very quickly and I'd
Hmm.
just rather not. And there's really
Right.
not this long history between them. It's just sort of temperament and
Sure.
energy and styles. So could someone's reaction or less than favorable opinion about me be all about them? Well, it's possible. It could be a mix of things, though.
Sure.
And I think that's where I'd kind of land, is it's usually a
Yeah.
mix of things. It's you remind them of someone, or
Sure.
you bring up stuff in them that kind of challenges part of what their
Mhm.
belief system is about themselves. So
Mhm.
that might be part of it, but it also might be that the two of you just don't kind of jive, or you don't
Right, right. Like, it could
mesh.
be simple, like, we
You
don't need
just
to
may not
overcomplicate
have
it.
exactly.
And that's and now you said something which leads me to the next topic that is very near and dear to my heart, lately, and because you had said you might remind them of something, and then I thought triggering.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
triggers, understanding
Mm.
and managing emotional triggers. So, I will speak very vulnerably, from my experience.
Mm.
In the past, and I'm still working on it, right? We're all a work in progress. I have had, as
Hmm.
you know, a sometimes if something triggers me, whether big or small, serious or not, whatever, I am it's sometimes hard for me to take that beat, take that pause before reacting. So I can be very reactive, and I can which doesn't always lend itself to great conversations or great outcomes. Sometimes it's great. I think it's great that I'm like super passionate
Sure.
about things and whatever, but if you can speak a little bit about what emotional triggers are, if someone doesn't know, and how they typically manifest themselves, whether
Sure.
in our daily lives or whatnot.
Absolutely. Great question. And really that is enormous progress and kind of lends itself to your emotional maturity developing, is even having an awareness of what my emotional triggers are. And my
Mhm.
explanation of that is really it's some sort of activation first in the body, kind of in your nervous system, that something feels a little energized.
Mhm.
Your heart beats a little faster.
Mhm.
You might breathe a little more quickly. You might perspire a little. Sometimes the
Mhm.
pupils dilate. It's not a relaxed state. The jaw tenses. I mean, I could go on about
Mhm.
the physical sensations that happen, but oftentimes people will miss those because they're in such a rapid fire pace to kind of, again, bring that experience of distress down and move on to something else. But without understanding kind of what is happening within the body, the emotions, it's very, very difficult then to kind of manage that trigger. So you kind of mentioned what we had talked about, that pause. That's a
Mhm.
really big part of the work
Mhm.
that I do with people, especially around emotion regulation, especially if I only have one part of a couple. in the
Sure.
room with me, I will talk about what somebody else did is useful in the extent that it helps understand what it brings up in you. It's
Right.
not so useful for us to guess about what all the meanings are
Right.
about what's going on for them, but it's much more useful for us to be able to understand more about you and what's happening
Right.
for you. So that's kind of the triggering part. The
Right.
second part is that pausing part. And I'd like to add a second piece,
Yeah.
which you and I have not spoken in a while. So I want to add the second part that I've added after the pause, which is to punctuate the pause with some words about what you're observing. So I
Hmm.
kind of have pause as first. And in the old days, I would talk a lot about the pause and how useful it was before you kind of react or respond.
Hmm.
And now I'm going to add the second kind of part of this, and maybe we'll meet again someday and I'll have another part of this. But then
Yeah.
the next part is this punctuation of putting words to what's happening in you, what you're observing before you kind of act or before
Right.
you respond. And that punctuate is kind of a new, maybe I'll have three P's. I don't know
I
what they
like
are yet,
that.
but pause and then punctuate with words what's happening inside you before you move on
React or
to doing
right.
something else. Or I'm noticing that I feel like this intense heat when you bring up your ex.
Right.
I just noticed that. I don't know what to do with it right now, my dear beloved, whoever you are.
Right.
But I do notice that that's happening. And probably right now isn't the best time for us to then figure out whatever it is that you guys have on your mind.
Right.
And so
And
anyway, that's kind of what
so, but
I'd
that
add.
beat, like that pause for me, like I mean, I don't, a lot of people don't even know. I told you, I mean, like, I don't even know if my family knows. If you can see it, I got a tattoo, my first tattoo ever. And I've always wanted one. I never knew exactly what I was going to get. It's a turtle. And literally
Mm,
the reason of for getting this is to remind me to slow it down. I
yeah,
talk fast, I think fast,
yeah,
I can be reactive, and it doesn't always work, but it's there to remind me. That's how important it is
nice.
to me to just slow it down. And let's use an example of someone who gets triggered because they hear a song that reminds them of their ex, right? And
Yes.
in that moment, that person might be like, oh my God, I miss my ex, I need to call them, right? I want to get back together. But it's in that pause that you will likely realize, right? Like, you don't want to get back together, you're having some nostalgic feelings about them, right?
Or maybe they do want to get back together and it might not exactly be the most opportune time. They're in the midst of another relationship, or
Right.
maybe there is something that actually needs to be handled in order to
Right.
take action on that nostalgic
Right.
feeling or that trigger. But the reality is that taking that action in the immediate is really more about, let's go back to the beginning, trying to mitigate that
Hmm.
anxiety, to take that
Hmm.
anxiety down. Let me act on this really fast, and then I might not feel whatever it is. I
Right.
might not feel my heart beating so fast, or I might not feel so tense on the inside. If I
Right.
take that pause, I might be
Yeah.
able to see with the kind of
That,
here and now that actually I just got chilly, or I
right.
love that song. And yes, it reminds me of a different time period. Or maybe I do want to get out of an old relationship that I'm kind of in and go back to
Yeah.
something else. I don't really know what the answer is,
Right.
but without that pause, all I
That,
know is that I'm reacting to want to get rid of the uncomfortable feelings.
right. And then that's when the reaction might be, I don't want to say nuclear explosive, but it could be
It could
less
escalate
than that.
very
It
quickly.
could escalate because
It
I
could
that's happened to me
escalate
because
quickly.
I don't take a minute. I'm like, I feel that drop in my stomach and I'm like, what
Oh,
the hell? And then I go and then and so
yeah.
I don't know what go means. It just means like react, but it's
Do
something that
something, right?
I do
Go.
something. Right,
That's right.
right,
So
right,
before the
right.
go, it's like that pause, like I'm feeling something, the acknowledgement of the something, that pause, and then the punctuation of that
Yeah, I like
with the
that.
moment, like being able to observe, I'm noticing or
Hmm.
gosh, I just felt this. Is that real? Checking
Right,
out with
right,
reality of here and now, because the
right.
part of the brain that wants to recruit those old narratives of the
Mm.
old stories is
Yeah.
really alive and powerful. And it
Yeah.
says, I'm keeping you safe. You better
Yeah.
respond, and you better
Yeah.
respond quickly.
Well, and especially, right, I'm 38, so this is 38 years of a way that, like,
Yeah,
I mean, not since I was like 2 years old, but like for the most of my life, I've
of
thought a certain
course.
way. So it's rewiring your brain, right? It's it's not
It's
easy.
a whole new way of
It's
orienting yourself,
exactly.
and that ability to slow down
A slow down. So
is
uh,
huge. You got a turtle right there to
I have the
remind
everyone look at
you.
the turtle.
I love
um,
it.
so the last like kind of topic I want to talk about, again, I could talk to you for hours.
No, this is perfect. I
But
think we've kind of hit the high
we're
points
hitting the
here.
high, right? But it kind of
Mhm.
goes with what we were saying. We talked about, kind of relationships and triggers, bringing past relationships into your current relationship, right? So if you're in a relationship, or even if you're not in a relationship, but you're dating, or you might want to be in one, and the idea of bringing kind of, I don't want to say baggage, I don't know if that's a good word, but like you bring stuff from your of your past relationships. So how would you say those past relationships shape our current behavior and expectations, which I know expectations can be sometimes challenging, how do you think it shapes that in our current? I know this is a really broad question, but how would you recommend someone handles that if a lot of their past kind of ick is coming into their current situation?
Yeah. I mean, I think it really goes back to exactly what we're talking about, really taking the pause
Hmm.
when that experience comes up and being able to kind of talk clearly about your experience of what you've brought to the table, of what you are bringing with you.
Hmm.
I don't know that you can even just limit it to previous romantic relationships. It's
I,
relationships with siblings, with parents, with colleagues. I mean, there's a
hmm.
lot of you remind me of, or this is
Yeah.
making me feel like, and very quickly people make sort of grand associations or kind of, global kind of, ideas, or
Hmm.
make a kind of
Hmm.
globalization
Hmm.
about just the situation from there and then having the same meaning here and now.
Right. But it
There
doesn't
and
always mean
then,
the same.
and very often it doesn't. Very
Right.
often you've got two very different people who are coming at it at very
Right.
different times in their lives. So very often it doesn't, but it may feel like
Mhm.
it. And the brain says,
Right.
I'm keeping you
Right.
safe. Let's go back to the way you reacted way back then. So it
Yeah.
really is a tricky one because we are bringing with us all of our history.
Hmm.
And it, lots of research says that even children in the same household with the same, and I say in that in sort of air quotes, because
Sure.
parents are not the same when they have a female child versus when they have a male
Oh, sure.
child. Parents are not the same when they have a child as their first sort of, kind of guinea pig, if you will.
Yeah.
The first child
Yeah.
is an experiment. By the third child, or however many subsequent siblings, it's a whole different ballgame. And the influence of siblings on those younger children
Yeah.
can have a huge impact that we
Yeah.
then kind of take into the relationships with teammates, like in
Mm.
sports, because for
Yep.
many people, collegiate sports were a huge influence, especially if they, kind of played at the college level, or
Sure.
some professional athletes I've had before say that those relationships are huge. Who the coach is kind of who the father figure is. And then moving that into
Mm.
romantic relationships, it's like we bring in those past relationships. My ex was X, and whenever you say this, it reminds me of that.
Oh,
That must mean you want to see everything that I'm
right.
working on my computer, because she wanted to always see. Well,
Right.
something was going on in that relationship that made the two of them have difficulty trusting. And now the
Right.
two of you have difficulty trusting one
It's
another. I
it's
mean,
so
I'm
yeah, no, I like in
just an
general you're saying,
general example.
I it's so it for me in the past when I've had, let's say, a less than favorable situation with an ex. Maybe they were a liar or a cheater. A lot of people unfortunately have dealt with cheating. It's hard though to then get into this a new relationship and just automatically trust and automatically,
Yeah.
because the littlest trigger might be like, there was experience way back for me, I think even before I was married, where a guy said one thing but then was fully lying, and I kind of found out, and then he admitted it, whatever. And then when I got in my next relationship, I just assumed, right? Like, I'm not stupid, but it's like an automatic assumption that my then boyfriend is going to do the same thing. And it's
And that's
hard
kind
because
of that globalization. That's
yeah,
exactly
yeah,
what I was talking about, is we make associations about
right,
what kept us safe. And for you, you found out kind of after the fact. I'm guessing it wasn't before. He didn't ask your
right,
permission to be with
right,
someone else. It was
right,
after
right.
the fact. And that made your brain go, hey, this isn't safe. And the brain is
Yeah.
always assessing for threat or safety,
Yeah. Yeah.
threat or
Yeah.
safety. So you're absolutely correct. It's a very easy jump if
Hmm.
something reminds the body of the way it felt in that less than safe situation previously, which,
Right.
the relationship ended for some reason, and now
Yeah.
you carry some of that residual memory in your body and in your awareness.
Mhm.
So you're looking for, gosh, can I trust this now? So
Right.
absolutely, Julie, you cannot just assume that that all goes away just because you start a new
Yeah.
relationship.
Darn
You
it.
can't. I think you're
It's
spot on.
mm,
And which means something, I don't know whether listeners are going to want to hear this or not, because very few of my dating patients say that they want to go slowly. But this is often the sort of new cultural norms are about going very quickly and then kind of
mhm.
swiping on to the next person if this doesn't
Mhm.
sort of very quickly manifest into something
Mhm.
just magical.
Yep.
And I'm not so sure that the magic can be determined in that kind of heightened state of anticipation and sort of fear and
Yeah.
anxiety. That's
Well,
something
there's
very
like
different.
it's funny, like when I was in my early 20s dating, I think I was like, ooh, butterflies, like, ooh, the guy I like's going to get the bar tonight. And then as I got older, I was actually talking about this with a friend the other day. It's like adult butterflies. Like it's a much more
Hmm,
mature, I mean, you hope, because butterflies aren't always a good thing, right? Because that then
right.
means anxiety, right? And you're revved
Exactly.
up.
And some anxiety can have that sort of pleasant excitement tinge. And some
Sure.
anxiety is that kind of, I want to get control and I want to get control fast. And what that can look like is,
Mm.
I want to secure this relationship.
Yeah.
I want to know
Yeah.
we're monogamous. I want to know
Yeah.
that, he's not having sex with this other one over here.
Yeah.
It's very scary. And so that anxiety is something we want to push down, and we will do
Hmm.
whatever measures we have to do to
Hmm.
do that. And so back to what I was going to say that isn't so easy is the taking it slow piece
It's not
is
easy.
often what I recommend for new couples, is to kind of have a period where you determine who the other person is. How do they respond during times of conflict? Because when
Sure.
couples come to me and say, well, everything was great until,
Yeah.
I know they really didn't spend much time kind of discerning, like, how are we going to talk about hard stuff?
I
Do I
mean,
have your
that's
permission to
right.
bring up this hard thing, like when your ex calls? Do I have your
Right.
permission to kind of talk about that with you?
Or like if something triggers you from, or if you feel like you're bringing baggage from your past relationship into your present one, like, can you talk about that? Right.
Can
That's
I
a
talk
big
about
thing.
any of
Yeah.
these things? Is
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
okay? And there's a fine line between how much your new partner is going to want to know
Right.
and how much you actually need to see your therapist
Right.
and talk
Which
about
is
that.
when you call Stephanie. No. And so kind of on that note, when you were saying like, oh, when your ex calls or this, there's something about romanticizing the past, right? And having these rosy colored glasses on. So I've been married, I'm divorced. I, can very much admit that sometimes when my wedding song comes on, I feel nostalgic, right? I feel this sense of, oh, would have been great if that worked. Like, oh, because he's such
Mm,
a great guy and all these things. I
mm.
know we weren't supposed to work. I know we're better off without each other. But that's very normal, correct? Yes, I'm looking for validation. No, I'm not. But
Well,
like,
I mean, you're very different now than
yeah,
perhaps you were. And for most people, we have many iterations of the self we show up
yeah,
as.
yeah.
And for many people, making decisions to have a partnership or a relationship in early 20s or even late 20s is
Yeah.
very different than the person that you show up as is in your mid to late 30s, early
Yeah.
40s, and so on. So each developmental stage, I kind of use a developmental model when I think about couples, about
Mhm.
what are the milestones for that phase of their
Mhm.
life. Many
Mhm.
couples come together for certain reasons in their 20s, very different perhaps in their 30s. And then in
Mhm.
their wage earning years, it's very different, where they're trying to sort of, promote their careers, and really, it looks different than it did in their earlier 20s, where they were trying to
Mhm.
establish a way to get out of their early family of origin, or so
Mhm.
there's lots of different reasons why couples come together, why people come together as a couple.
Mhm.
And then, yes, you hear something or see something that reminds you of that past relationship, and it is quite normal to
Yeah.
then only think about, we do tend to kind of, obscure, put in the way back corner the difficult things
Yep.
of
Yep.
why, in fact, we aren't together
We
now.
aren't.
So I
Right. And
will,
reminding yourself of that.
yes,
To,
well,
to
I
the
will
why you're
often
not
have
together.
people, when they start to get too nostalgic or start to miss someone too much, I will have them make a list. And
Yeah.
it might be, I kind of call it the
Yeah.
list of 10 things, 100 things, 1,000
Yep.
things, reasons why that didn't work, couldn't
Yep.
work, and will never work. And
Right.
then you've got
Exactly.
something very concrete. It couldn't work, it didn't work, and
Right.
it will never work.
And it will
But
never work.
what are the things? And then just really in your moment of doubt or in your moment of kind of going back thinking, oh, this was so, go back to the list and you will be reminded. It
Right.
will
Right.
be
Like,
right there. And you may
right.
think of more things over
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Like you think you kind of like forget the bad things, but then if you get, just take a beat, right? Turtle,
Yeah.
you then can be like, but we didn't work because of X, Y, and Z.
Yes, that's
So
right.
anyway,
And
I
that
thought that was
list
important.
being right there, that list
Yeah.
sort of,
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of journals, as you know.
Yeah.
I put
Yeah.
those journals out a few years. I didn't
Yeah.
include that, but that would actually be, if I just had 100 blank pages, it would be the sort of hundreds list
Yeah. Why
or
we
10
didn't work
reasons
out.
why, right, why
Or
it didn't
type it out and
happen.
print it and just have it in your bag.
Type it
Like,
out and
yeah.
print it, right?
Yeah.
Because there
Yeah.
is that sort of, especially if you weren't the person to end it. If you were the
Right.
person to end it, you may feel more confident about the
Sure.
ending, but if you
Sure.
weren't, it may
It's
be
tough. Yeah.
difficult to kind of
Sure.
put that nostalgia in its proper place, which is really
Sure.
just that memory that evokes some sweetness.
Like put it on the shelf and appreciate it. And yeah. Okay. So
Exactly.
we're going to wrap up. There were like some other questions I wanted to ask at the end, but I'm just going to ask the one main one so we can fully
Okay,
wrap up.
sure.
Obviously the show is called Life Unscripted. What does living a life unscripted mean to you?
Hmm. Well, I think it's something like what happened today, where you kind of sent me a couple of ideas and said, would you be willing to
Yeah.
talk about these things?
Yeah.
And I said, sure, sounds great. And that we
Yeah.
really didn't do like this long, laborious prep or
Right.
any kind of, and I think that that's sort of over time, what I've come to land on as being sort of unscripted is that I kind of trust
Mm-hmm.
my body's wisdom. I
Mm-hmm.
trust my sort of emotional wisdom about myself, my
Mm-hmm.
self-knowledge. I kind of trust that now to lead me in the right next step.
I
I
love
don't
that.
sort of
Trusting.
just, yeah, self-trust, that I don't just sort of think I have to, that somebody else has the answer somewhere else. I love gathering new information. I love taking classes and listening to
Mm-hmm.
podcasts and reading new books.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm trusting that kind of, if something's not right for me, it's not right
You'll
for me.
and you'll figure it out.
Yeah, and I'll figure out
Yeah.
what to do in its place,
Right.
or I'll make the
Right.
change. And that's kind of unscripted. I don't know what direction it'll go, but I do know that I kind of trust that if it's not right for me, if it doesn't feel right, then it's not right for me. And I'm okay with that.
I love that. What a perfect way to end. Okay, well, as we wrap up, thank you so much, Stephanie,
My
for being on. You know,
pleasure.
you've
So
changed
good to
my life
see
in so many
you.
ways. And
So
I
good to see
will
you,
link,
Julie.
so good to see you. In my show notes, I'm going to link your Instagram,
Oh,
Distinctive
love it.
Practice, and everything where they can find you, because I know, so we can finish up.
Perfect.
And that's it. So thank you. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Okay.